the drones are actually being used as a consumable item in the way that a bullet was a consumable item for NATO forces in the past. So again, really what we're talking about is the deep battle by both Russia in terms of the electricity infrastructure in Ukraine and the Ukrainian attacks on the oil production and gas production in Russia. Now, of course, one of the things that the Ukrainians have done over the Christmas period too is absolutely stop the transit of Russian gas across their terrain to Europe. Now, all this plays into the sort of potential collapse of the economy in the future. It also plays into the fact that both the attacks on the oil and gas facilities and on their logistic hubs make it more difficult for Russia to go towards any meaningful operations in the future.
A lot of people are increasingly talking about the Russian economy and making that very point that if this war drags on further into 2025, possibly beyond, there may come a crunch point. I mean, we've seen, for example, how the value of the ruble fell very sharply after the incursion into Kursk in August. Okay, it's recovered somewhat since, but not completely. The governor of the central bank in Russia has been pretty critical privately, apparently, according to sources, about the war and the cost of the war and the impact on the Russian economy. Do you think, especially if you couple that with the potential need for fresh mobilization at some point this year, if the war drags on, it could create almost a perfect storm for Putin?
Yeah, all that is possible. Mobilization is a societal risk for him. The economy is a risk, but he doesn't have that elite defection at the moment. And as long as you've got this digital authoritarianism within the regime, and he's been there a long time now, approaching 25 years in one form or another as prime minister or president, then you've still got a very benign population. This really goes back to our old friend in the Wagner group, Prigozhin, when he sort of said we might have to live like North Korea for a few years to ensure that we're successful in Ukraine. And it might be the fact that they do that. And sometimes you can overplay the amount that sort of the degradation of an economy can have an impact. Because, for example, I remember when I was doing the sort of job for real, in 2012, the Syrian economy, all the indicators there were red, and yet that sustained itself for another 12 years. So you can live through a lot of inflation, you can live through a lot of economic imbalances if you really choose to do so. It's whether those fractures start coming, I think, in the population, which are the key thing to look for, and that really is to do with the mobilization. You can mobilize people, but one of the things which is significant is the losses. So the figures which came out for 2024 suggested that the Russians had lost 3,000 tanks and 9,000 armored fighting vehicles in 2024. Now, when we're talking about what's happened in the last 2 days, the Russians overnight, night of 5th, 6th, lost 14 tanks and 45 AFVs, along with 62 artillery systems. That level of loss is unsustainable in terms of having effective mechanized operations, which is why you are seeing this sort of devolving of civilian vehicles and sort of Mad Max type vehicles appearing on the battlefield for Russia. It's not that they've completely run out of vehicles, but there'll be a time when they culminate in equipment which is valid in terms of a modern fighting force. One thing you can say about the Kursk incursion at the moment, even though it is small scale, is that in the sword versus the shield, it seems that there's been effective use of electronic warfare by the Ukrainians to negate the drones of the Russians. And one of the things we're likely to see later on this month is that in the Ramstein meeting, the drone coalition, now the Ramstein meetings are taken over by NATO, and the drone coalition is led by the UK, that there will be an even greater preponderance of drones by Ukraine this year, partly led through that and partly by indigenous production. And that's also one of the things that the Ukrainians have future-proofed themselves in, which is their missile and drone production for the day that Trump comes and may not give them any further support. So that future-proofing is there, and the Ukrainians are very cannily using drones and electronic warfare as a force multiplier to make up for those deficiencies that they absolutely have in manpower. No one wants to join the infantry at the moment in Ukraine, and that is a structural and mobilization weakness within the Ukrainian armed forces too.
That's absolutely fascinating. So much to unpick there. Just on the Russian supply issues, I mean, we've spoken so much about the Russian casualty rate and whether that is sustainable. Do you think that too many people have ignored for too long the supply issues that Russia also have?
I think so. It was a fascinating thing about the drones are actually being used as a consumable item in the way that a bullet was a consumable item for NATO forces in the past. So again, really, what we're talking about is the deep battle by both Russia in terms of the electricity infrastructure in Ukraine and the Ukrainian attacks on the oil production and gas production in Russia. Now, of course, one of the things that the Ukrainians have done over the Christmas period too is absolutely stop the transit of Russian gas across their terrain to Europe. Now, all this plays into the sort of potential collapse of the economy in the future. It also plays into the fact that both the attacks on the oil and gas facilities and on their logistic hubs make it more difficult for Russia to go towards any meaningful operations in the future. But as I keep saying, they still believe they're sort of winning. Their rate of advance from August to December was slightly quicker than it's been in the past. But, 6 months ago, James, we were talking about Pokrovsk, and here we are. They still haven't breached the third and fourth lines of defense, which lead up to Pokrovsk. And they may take it, but they're not going to take it again for another 6 months. Within that period, we've got 5 months of Trump being there. And again, the situation could change significantly because of that factor.
If this war does drag on throughout this year, maybe beyond, what tactics do you think we will increasingly see from the Ukrainians? I mean, you mentioned their very effective use of electronic warfare in Kursk, for instance, but also I wonder if they will make even more use of, for example, political assassinations. We saw what happened with General Kirillov in Moscow only a few weeks ago. Do you think they will look more at that if they've got an issue with infantry on the front line?
Well, I just think that's another weapon in their armory. And although the Russians sort of railed against that, it's nothing new from the Russian side. Of course, they've tried to assassinate Budanov and his wife a number of times. So producing any uncertainty in your adversary, both in the military, political sphere, or whatever economic sphere, is something you need to do. But of course, you need to do all these together in a coherent campaign plan. So it looks to me at the moment that everyone has sort of really disregarded the Zelensky victory plan for good reasons in lots of ways, because it wasn't really socialized with the West. I think the fact that General Kellogg is there and can at least be an honest interlocutor with Zelensky, whether he can do the same thing with Putin is another thing. And that's also one of the important things, that Putin has said that he won't talk to Zelensky. He will only talk to Trump. And that's important because he thinks that Trump at the moment will sell Ukraine down the river. But that also disregards the fact that you must give agency both to Ukraine and Zelensky in any negotiations. And of course, it's a lot wider than that. It's to do with the EU and the countries that border. For example, in 2014, after the initial invasion, the former US Soviet Union countries that bordered Ukraine, what we call the Bucharest Nine, formed the Bucharest Nine, and during that period after 1991, willingly turned to NATO because they knew what it was like to be under the boot of the Russians. So they have agency too. So this isn't just a stitch-up between Trump and Putin. There are a number of other factors in this and those who have agency within this. That's why I return to that point that neither Russia or Ukraine will take a bad deal, and any deal that Ukraine has to look at or offered to them has to be put to the people of Ukraine.
But I also wonder if Putin in particular is underestimating the extent to which Trump won't take a bad deal. I mean, this is the man who prides himself as being a deal maker. He put his name on the book, The Art of the Deal, and he doesn't want to necessarily be presiding over a deal that is seen to be too favourable to Putin, where people can level the charge that he's a lapdog of Vladimir Putin? And if Putin is clever, does he not need to accept some concessions that Trump can portray as, look, I've made Vladimir Putin make some compromises here, but as long as Putin can internally within Russia sell that as some kind of moral victory, then from his perspective, both sides can be happy. But do you think Putin is prepared to make those compromises to allow Trump to sell whatever deal comes out as a great act of statesmanship on Trump's part?
I don't think he is at the moment. And this again comes back to the negotiating tactics that the Russians always subscribe to. That is, demand the maximum. Second one, always give ultimatums. And thirdly, don't give an inch in negotiations, because there are always useful idiots in the West who'll give you something, and therefore you'll either have a third or a half of something you didn't have before. That is the way that the Russian mindset on negotiations works. They might want negotiations, not yet, but they don't want to negotiate.
Just finally, Chip, when you hear people saying 2025 is going to be the year that the war in Ukraine ends, what is your response? How likely do you think that is?
Well, I always sort of say that war is the most complex activity in the universe, and that there are too many variables to establish this. I think one of my opening gambits about the amount of time it took to get to the armistice in Korea is probably worth reiterating here. You need a lot of meetings, a lot of negotiations between a lot of complex parties to get to any sort of solution. So if we think this is going to be over by the spring of 2025, I would very much doubt it.
Major General Chip Chapman, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us again on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.